Hi and welcome to Police Stories Podcast. This is a series of, it's a good start, this is a series of short stories about my 28-year career in the UK police force. I hope you've been enjoying it so far. If you've been before, and if not, welcome. If this is your first time, you might want to start from the first episode, as this is now episode 79. Seems quite surprising. Not ideal recording conditions today, and I hope the sound will be okay for you. Fingers crossed. We'll see how it goes. It's Christmas Eve, and I'm still here in Portugal in the camper van, so I'm not too far from a main road as well, so I'm hoping you won't get it too much, but you'll have to bear with me. So thanks very much for the downloads the last week. Very good again, really good, and some nice comments on the various social media platforms. I don't know if you've seen the Facebook page as well, Police Stories Podcast, but some not so nice comments on there. But the reality is, that's it. As we've discussed many times, a lot of people don't like the police and what it represents. So their level is that they'll go on and make comments and derogatory comments and what have you. It's it's what I've had throughout my career, and no problems at all. There's no bad feedback apparently. But okay, this week then we're going to talk about, we'll see how it goes, but maybe 2 or 3 different things. We're going to start off with one which was a missing person again. So I'm back on the streets, as you remember, in uniform, working for Police Scotland in a small town on the west coast of Scotland. We got called to reports of a missing person. Neighbour hadn't seen the guy who lived next door, for a week or 2, I don't think. And after a while, they called it in to us. And what normally happens is, certainly when people used to get, milk delivered to their doorstep, you'd find that, the milk would sort of build up on the door, or people would notice that there was letters, sticking out through the letterbox. Or the classic sign, particularly in the summer, unfortunately, was people would say there's a bad smell, or, they'd seen a lot of flies at the window, which of course is always a bad sign potentially. So we went to this address. There was some checks we did on this guy first, sort of basic checks that you do for any missing person. We looked to see if he was on any of our systems, which he wasn't. Then the next check for sure is a hospital check, a quick phone call or a pop up to the local hospital, because they may well have been taken in for some condition or something. And then obviously, the neighbour wouldn't necessarily be aware of that. So you try and do as much sort of digging as you can before you actually go to the address, because sometimes, you just can't get in, or you might have to force entry, which is not necessarily a problem, although, we're not going out of our way to damage people's doors and things. So we'd done all our checks as much as we could, and we'd not really turned up any reason. This guy wasn't that old. I think he was about 60 or so, in reasonable health from what we understood. There was no sort of underlying medical conditions or anything like that. And we went to his address and found the door ajar from memory. Or certainly, I think it was maybe closed but not locked. And that wasn't actually that unusual, given where we were in that sort of location. It's quite rare for people to lock their doors still. It's quite a low crime area. There's bound to be a crime spree now, I've said that obviously, but generally there isn't high crime, and quite often it's quite an old-fashioned place, and people leave doors unlocked. And particularly in Scotland, I've noticed they have storm doors, so they have outer doors on their front door, which then creates like a porch effectively before you get to their inner front door. And quite often, even when the weather was terrible, those outer storm doors would be left open, sometimes not just unlocked, but literally wide open. And the reason I was told for that was, for travellers, it goes back, it's quite a nice, quaint thing, but for travellers of old, that were out on a very stormy night and needed shelter, then basically by leaving those storm doors open, you're inviting someone just to get out of the weather, for a short period of time behind those storm doors. And you'd be surprised how many people still did that. I never actually saw anyone sheltering in them, but it was a nice idea. So we went to this address. It was a flat, from memory. It was a first floor flat. So we got the neighbour who'd called us to buzz us in the exterior. And then we went in, and I think there was stairs ahead of us straight up to this sort of first floor flat, which in fact was top floor because it was only 2 floors. And we found the door, as I say, unlocked, but closed too. So we gained entry reasonably easy. Now, there was no nasty smells or anything like that, and we had a very quick sort of glance around, and obviously a shout out before we went in, because it might just be the person's in there, and they haven't heard us coming. But there was nothing obvious at all, and no signs of a disturbance. The door was secure in that there was no signs of a forced entry. The lock wasn't broken. Again, these are things we're sort of looking for. I think there was one more neighbour upstairs, and we kind of knocked the door and had a chat with them just to see if they'd seen or heard anything sort of unusual, and they basically said the same thing, not seen him for a couple of weeks or so. So we started to do a search around the flat, and we went from room to room. I think it was only a 2-bed flat maybe, so there wasn't a lot to it. My colleague sort of went one way off down the corridor, and I went the other way, and no sign of anything. And say no smell, so we were reasonably confident, at that point, based on smell, that he wasn't there, so that was good. And then as we walked in, or as I walked into the bedroom, as soon as I pushed the bedroom door, I realised there was going to be an issue, because the bedroom door felt exceptionally heavy. I almost had to sort of push it with my shoulder to open it. And having been in this scenario probably half a dozen times at least in my career, maybe more, I realised what was probably occurring. And sure enough, then on the round sort of door handle, I could see a relatively thin piece of nylon rope that had a loop round it, around the door handle, and it went up and over the top of the door and back down the other side, and it was very taut. And when I then stepped the other side of the door, in fact, you couldn't get to the door initially because it was closed on itself. It had sort of swung open, if you like, when I'd pushed it. So I got round the other side of the door and found the male who had hung himself. He'd committed suicide and hung himself. So very sad to find that. I still don't know really why he wasn't smelling that much, because we've talked about death and bodies quite a bit, and generally they do have quite a smell to them. But in this case there was nothing, and he'd been there for a couple of weeks or so. So I called out to my colleague and said, I found him, he's just in here. And I think because I was relatively matter-of-fact about it, she expected him to be sat up in bed with the flu or something, and that he was just feeling a little poorly, and she kind of came around the corner and was like, well, where is he? And I said, he's just around the side of the door, and she stepped round the back of the door and was, I think, a little bit surprised that I'd been, relatively calm and laid back about the whole thing, because I'm afraid I was pretty used to it at that point. And so at that point, the things we were interested in particularly is the knot that was tied around the throat. That's always very important, and quite often we take photos of those. And in fact, what they've done in Police Scotland, and a lot of forces do this now, is they'd issued out the PDAs. They're basically big mobile phones that have all the capabilities phones have, so you can take photos, and more importantly, you can access a lot of the police systems on them. So people imagine that you're sitting in the lay-by playing a game, but the reality is I can write a statement on my phone, I can fill out all sorts of paperwork just on my phone without having to return to the Nick, which is a really good resource. So we use the camera sometimes, and I was able to take photos, close-up photos of the knot around this guy's neck. Very important. And because clearly, life was extinct, as we were saying, he was very dead. It wasn't like he was fresh, warm to the touch, and this was something that just happened and I'm about to start CPR. He was absolutely stone cold, and you can tell from the colour of him that, he'd been there a while. So we didn't feel the need to cut him down and start CPR or anything. So we informed the supervisor, which is pretty standard stuff, the sergeant, and then he came out as well to the location. And then really we're gathering evidence for, in Scotland, the Procurator Fiscal, or down south, the coroner, because there will now be an inquest into this person's death. for a ruling which, in this case was, as you'd expect, suicide. But we looked round the address, and I think eventually we found there was various medication. It was all quite neat, there was no sort of sign of, as I say, anything sort of untoward happening there. And then screwed up in one of the bins, we found several scrawlings that were sort of purporting to be suicide notes, explaining why he'd done it. I think he'd maybe tried to write them maybe 2 or 3 times, but hadn't actually got to complete them for whatever reason. But it just gave us a bit of an insight. And from memory, I think he had a serious illness, possibly cancer, and he feared what was coming, so he decided to take his own life. So it's quite a sad case, as they all are. And then it was around about this time that we started hearing rumblings through, sort of the big bosses at work, the higher ranking officers. And this was a time where COVID had started and was looming. It was getting worse. We'd seen it in Italy. We'd seen it spreading throughout Europe. And, initially it kind of, I don't know about you, but I saw it on the news and saw what was happening in Italy and thought, that's terrible, but it'll never happen here, and I don't know why I thought that, just naivety, I guess, on my part. But obviously we saw it spreading throughout Europe and some lockdowns going in place. And then we started hearing a few whispers through the grapevine at work that, well, that's not impossible, that could happen here. And it still seemed, well, literally impossible to me, that could actually happen here. But sure enough, as it got closer and closer, we had about 24 hours notice that something was going to happen, probably a lockdown across the country. And there was a bit of not a panic, but there was a certain amount of work being done in relation to getting hold of PPE. I mean, luckily, all police forces have a lot of PPE in terms of face masks, gloves. At the time, kind of what I'd call a socko suit, a white scenes of crime suit that with a hood that you zip up and things. And we weren't really sure if that was going to be needed. Then there was talk that everyone would have to be face fitted for a specific type of mask called FFP3, which was, better than just the sort of paper mask that we all had to wear. But then they also said that really for full effect, you'd need to be clean shaven. So again, there was a sort of ruling brewing that all officers that had beards, which included me, that we would have to shave, be clean shaven. And there was a few moans and grumbles about that, which was surprising really, because, given what was happening around the world and in this country, in the UK, it was the least of my worries, quite frankly. Now, my wife worked in the NHS, and she was a radiographer, which is the person who carries out x-rays, amongst other things. And of course, she had seen a huge increase in chest x-rays required. So very much she was ramping up at work as well, and being called on for more and more chest x-rays. And she was seeing, people coming in very seriously ill that she knew were unfortunately eventually dying. So it was not lost on both of us, just how serious this situation was. And sure enough, obviously we all sat there and watched Boris give the news to the country that, there was going to be a national lockdown and that the whole country was going to be locked down. And of course, we immediately knew somebody's got to enforce this, and who is that going to fall to? Well, clearly, the police. Simple as that. There was talk of the army, and maybe if it got out of control, the army would have to come in and enforce it, so that we could get on with normal police work. But how was that going to work realistically? And of course, this was completely new ground. No one had any ideas just how it was going to work, basically, or if it was going to work. So lots of laws were rushed in. And I know you'll be aware of this, but I'm just telling it from the police side of things. Lots of new laws were rushed in, and which got really confusing. We almost had to have daily briefings specifically about what was and wasn't allowed. We could barely keep up with it. So how members of the public that were relying on, Facebook and various other unreliable sources to figure out what they actually were allowed to do. This family unit and bubbles, and you can meet one person and you can only travel X amount of miles from your house, and initially you couldn't go out, and then you could, go within a local distance. Of course, well, what was a local distance? And it got very, very difficult to police. But one thing we did have to do, of course, was work, absolutely flat out full time. There was loads of people called in on overtime because it, very much caught people on the hop in terms of the resources it would take, because it created a lot of work. Initially, we were thinking, well, maybe there won't be too much work for us, because everyone will be inside. Unfortunately, of course, that wasn't the case. Initially, I think for the first maybe week, the whole country was in shock and there was no extra work. And in fact, it was I'll use the Q word, quiet. Nothing happened at all, really, because I say everyone, the whole country was getting used to what was happening and obviously pretty much in shock at what we were seeing on the news, etc. But it slowly developed, and much as we see at, this time of year, Christmas, particularly, things like domestics, arguments between partners, husband and wives, gets very much worse. And I think it's that pressure cooker environment. People are stuck together. Normally they go off and see friends and do things, but now they're stuck together in the same house. Quite often drinking and alcohol was involved. So people would, get out and, were drinking at home, and of course, immediately we had, the rule breakers that, and all the various conspiracy theorists that sort of popped up to tell us that, it was the government were, it was their way of reinforcing their grip on us, and there was actually no virus, and all the anti-vaxxers came out. It became very, very silly in a lot of ways. Yeah, so to start with, not too bad. And then certainly in Scotland, and particularly where I was working, there was a lot of holiday homes that were owned by people generally from down south, London and the home counties, had little cottages tucked away in remote, Scottish villages that were very quaint and had nice, sea views or loch views. And what they decided to do, thinking they would be clever, was the moment the lockdown happened, they thought, well, I can either sit in central London with 8 million other people, sort of fighting in the supermarkets to get hold of, a dwindling amount of food and toilet paper. If you remember that one, toilet paper started running out, then it was a run on toilet paper. So that became like gold dust, and you couldn't get hold of that. So they thought, rather than doing that, I'm going to get myself up to the Highlands. I'm going to get myself off to my holiday home that's, tucked away in this little village in remote Scotland, and I'll just keep out the way. There's not so much virus up there, which was true. We did have it, but it wasn't as bad as down south, certainly in the area I worked in. And also, they thought that that's fine, I'll just sort of, keep tucked out of the way. But very quickly we saw what was happening, and new rules were brought in that you had to stay in your home of residence. Now, in these small villages, it's a community and everyone knows, who lives there and who doesn't live there. And invariably, the locals knew straight away, that, the house on the corner was a holiday home owned by somebody in London who came up, 3 or 4 times a year or at Christmas or whatever it was. So the moment they started turning up en masse, and they were literally en masse for all these second homes, they were straight on the phone to us to tell us. And initially there was no rules against it, but that very quickly changed when it was obvious what was happening, because of course these villages that may only have, 100 residents, suddenly had 150 residents. And those 100 residents that lived there, of course, were relying on the little local shops that carried, very little, just your basics. And of course they were struggling to get stock like everywhere else was. And so you suddenly, swell the population by an extra third of that village, and the little amount of food and toilet paper, that there is to go round, was vastly reduced. And of course it was causing for sure some angst, amongst the locals, and a certain amount of animosity as well. And of course we were getting the phone calls. So then for the next, several weeks, if not months, we spent our time going round to those local villages where, they'd called us, the residents, and said, Mr. and Mrs. Bloggs from London have come up here and are staying in their holiday home on the corner. They do not live here. So then we end up with this ridiculous sort of cat and mouse game where we would go around and knock on the door, and they wouldn't answer, so we'd have to go back. And these villages, were remote, so they might take us an hour to get out to the villages, and we might drive all that way to find, they're not going to answer the door. So we ended up having to be like a bit sneaky, and going out at different times and seeing if, lights were on, and walking around into people's back gardens and things to catch them out. And basically, and then even when, they answer the door, some people would just accept it and go, okay, fine, yeah, I know, we'll leave. And others would say, no, I live here. They try it on, basically. No, I live here, this is my home address. And you'd be like, oh, great, if you can just show me your council tax then. And then you'd also do some checks on the cars that were on the driveway, and of course they'd be registered at the same address down in London, and then they couldn't produce, a council tax in their name, or you'd ask to see their driving licence, which would be the same address that the cars are registered. And you'd be like, look, clearly you don't live here. The residents know you don't live here. You're putting a massive strain and pressure on these local shops. You're going to have to go back to your proper residence, your home address in London. It's just not fair. And I have to say, of all the people we spoke to, and there was a lot, there was only one or two that really didn't like what we were telling them, and really tried to wriggle out of it, and that we had to kind of threaten with fines and, in one case, arrest eventually, because he immediately started getting very aggressive. So regardless of the reason, if he was going to get aggressive with us like that, he was going to get himself arrested anyway. But it didn't come to that, and I personally didn't have to issue a fine. A couple of stern words, a bit of a warning, and that was enough really, and those people were on their way. But that took up a lot of our time and work. And then it changed slightly when they opened it up to where you could go camping, and you could be outdoors, you could walk your dog and all that sort of business. Again, it came in with this this range, within 5 miles of your house. So then you were trying to establish ridiculously, well, where do you live, and then is that 5 miles as the crow flies or by the road, so the onus was on us, and hopefully a big dose of common sense came in. But we started to see camper vans, when it eased a bit and people were allowed to travel, we started to see camper vans coming up, particularly from down south again, to all these remote spots with a similar point of view, that they wanted to be out of the way, and they sometimes quite often brought their own food, so they were self-sufficient to a degree, but it wasn't really playing by the rules. And we regularly had to visit these various sort of sneaky campsites that we knew, various lay-bys and woods and things that had car parks in, and unfortunately moved those people on as well, but the classic was, you turn up at night and you say, look, you've got to go, and straight away they'd say, well, I've had a drink, I've had a couple of beers, and of course, if someone, we weren't going to muck about, start breath testing people and saying, oh no, you're okay to drive, because there's issues with that, because if they've just had a drink, even if you waited 20 minutes, sometimes the alcohol level can rise still. So, they might blow under the limit with you an hour down the road, because they've had quite a bit to drink, they're now over the limit. And can you imagine the nightmare scenario where they get stopped by another cop who breaths them and says, you're over the limit. And they say, well, that other cop said I could drive and he breath tested me and I was all right, so it just was griefy. Invariably, the common sense option was to say, okay, stay tonight, but you must go tomorrow. If you're still here tomorrow when I come back, I'll be issuing you a fine, And again, for me personally, that's all it ever took, So people moved on, and all I kept seeing frustratingly on the news and the paper, and everyone I ever spoke to and saw a lot of myself on social media, was that, oh, lockdown, I'm so bored, I wish we had something to do, oh, I can't wait to go outside and breathe the fresh air, I just want to get out, I just want to do something. And I guess if I was in the same scenario, I probably would have felt the same. But unfortunately, I was flat out working. We were busier than ever, quite often being asked to do 12-hour days or nights, working extra hours. My wife was the same, back-to-back chest x-rays. So the pair of us had never worked harder. We'd never done so many hours. And, to top it off was all these people moaning of how bored they were stuck at home. And we were thinking, we'd love to be stuck at home. Why can't we just sit at home like everyone else and do nothing, But somebody had to get out there and keep things going. And of course it was, as virtually everything is that the police do, very unpopular in sometimes, particularly when you were dealing with your anti-vaxxers, etc. We had a few more serious incidents as well. We had fairly early on our sort of SOP, our standard operating procedure, if you like, was somebody who we believed had COVID. Then we were to get suited up, in a full white Socko suit with an FFP3, mask and hood up and gloves and all this business, which was a nice idea. And of course it was the Rolls Royce of, looking after ourselves, but highly impractical because it took time. But we did have a call fairly early on that there was a guy who kind of weaponized COVID, and that he said, I have COVID, I've got it really badly. And he was walking around on the seafront basically threatening that he was going to infect people and infect everyone. There was definitely some mental health at play. So that was the one occasion that we were tasked to go down and deal with this guy. So myself and my colleague, there was already some cops on the scene who didn't really have any protection apart from the thin paper masks on, and they were just trying to keep a distance and engage with this guy. We went round the corner, got suited up, put on these full white suits, and basically came out of there looking like we'd, just come from a murder scene, what with the white suits on and double gloves and, taped up wrists and boots, and it took forever. And eventually we went to deal with this guy. And he, claimed to have COVID, although seemed relatively healthy. He wasn't sort of coughing his guts up or showing any of the symptoms. And we basically put him in the back of our prison van and took him off to the hospital. Now, this is where it got really embarrassing, because the NHS staff that were doing all the dangerous stuff, dealing with proper COVID, types that were very, very ill, because of the lack of PPE, they basically had a pair of gloves if they were lucky, and sometimes they didn't even have that, and a thin paper mask. And we turned up looking like we were on a one-way ticket to, outer space, saying we got this person here who says they got COVID. And we knew all these guys and girls pretty well in the hospital, because obviously we're out there all the time. And they thought it was hilarious. They were kind of like, what have you come as, And we felt a bit stupid, to say the least. But anyway, we got over it. We got a bit of Mickey taken out of us, and then carried on. But yes, it turns out he didn't have COVID at all. It was mental health. So we'd not come to any harm, thankfully. But certainly for the next few months, any time you went to a job and somebody was getting aggressive with you, they'd invariably throw in the COVID card, tell you they had COVID and that they were going to infect us, and that, they would spit on us, etc. So some fairly unpleasant times for sure. And like most other people, I got COVID during that time, and so did my wife eventually. Thankfully, we're both okay, but unfortunately, as we know, thousands of others weren't. So we consider ourselves lucky, given the roles that we had during that time. It was certainly, as it was for everyone, a scary old time, and incredible, really, even to think back now that happened. And I can imagine, sort of telling your grandkids about it in the future. I think it'll be really hard for them to believe and get their heads around, we were locked down and this is what happened. But of course, they do say that, unfortunately, we may well be in that position again. So not the most cheerful thought, given particularly the time of year. But there we go. So a little bit shorter today, but I think that'll cover it. There's not really any point getting into any more incidents at this point. So I wish you a happy Christmas and a happy New Year, and all the best, and we'll speak again soon. All right, take it easy. Cheers, bye.